Welcome to Echoes of War and Battles, History You Missed. Today, we're unveiling the story of not just a man, but a legend, a warrior of valor, a leader on the battlefield, and a name that has echoed through generations. This is the life and legacy of William Wallace, from his birth, to his rise as Scotland's defender, to his final sacrifice. So grab your popcorn, sit back, and join us as we uncover history together. And if this is your first time here, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon, so you never miss the stories we bring to life. Scotland in the late 13th century was a land of contrasts, breathtaking in its natural beauty, yet scarred by political turmoil. The highlands rolled endlessly with green hills and misty glens. Rivers cut deep into the land, and small stone-built villages clung to survival under an uncertain sky. Life was harsh. Crops failed often, winters were bitter, and clans fought one another for scraps of power. Yet above all these struggles, one shadow loomed largest, the looming power of England. Into this fragile and uncertain world was born William Wallace, around the year 1270. Some claim his birthplace was Elderslie, a modest village in Renfrewshire, while others argue for Ayrshire. The truth is blurred by centuries of storytelling, but what is certain is that he was no prince, no heir to a mighty castle. He came from the family of minor landholders. His father, Sir Malcolm Wallace, was a man of some respect, but far from the great nobles who sat at councils or commanded large armies. Unlike the peasants who made up the vast majority of Scotland's people, the Wallaces carried status enough for their children to learn more than labor. William was blessed with an uncle who was a priest, a man who recognized the boy's potential and insisted that he receive an education. In an age when only 1 in 100 could read, Wallace learned Latin, the language of the church and of scholars. He absorbed French, the tongue of nobility. He studied scripture, poetry, and the principles of justice that rang through ancient texts. These lessons shaped his mind, even as life in the rugged Scottish countryside hardened his body. But education alone did not define him. Outside the cloisters, Wallace trained in the ways of survival and combat. He hunted in the forests, drew back bows taller than himself, and wrestled with the other boys of the village. As he grew, he towered over his peers, broad-shouldered, fiery, and strong. He was no pampered noble son, but a lad forged by the rough hands of nature and the callouses of daily toil. Already, villagers whispered of his fierce spirit, of the sharp light in his eyes when he spoke of Scotland, yet even in his youth, the weight of history bore down on him. In 1286, tragedy struck Scotland. King Alexander III, the strong ruler who had kept the kingdom united, fell to his death from a horse on a stormy night. His sudden loss left a void no one could fill. His only heir, a young girl known as the Maid of Norway, was frail and lived across the sea. When she too died just a few years later, Scotland was left leaderless. The throne stood empty. The clans bickered, and rival claimants to the crown plunged the nation into uncertainty, and into that vacuum stepped Edward of England, a man who saw Scotland not as a neighbor but as a prize to be seized. Edward, later called Longshanks for his towering stature, was cunning, ruthless, and ambitious. He was invited to arbitrate between the Scottish claimants, but instead of being a neutral judge, he set himself up as overlord. In 1292, he placed John Balliol upon the throne of Scotland, but it was a throne in name only. Edward made Balliol his puppet, forcing him to bow and pay homage as a vassal. The humiliation was deep. Scots who had long considered themselves a free people were now treated as subjects of a foreign king. English garrisons moved into their towns. Taxes increased, demanded not for Scotland's prosperity but for Edward's endless wars abroad. Soldiers enforced these decrees with iron fists, often with cruelty and arrogance. For villagers and farmers, life became unbearable. For young Wallace, watching this humiliation unfold, it became unbearable too, not only in body, but in spirit. Imagine the teenage William Wallace standing in a crowded market square. English officers demand coin from poor farmers whose families already starve. One soldier mocks a villager's accent, striking him down for daring to complain. The crowd stays silent, fearful, powerless. But in Wallace's heart, silence turns to rage. These were not mere taxes. These were chains, meant to bind his people in submission. And even then, perhaps unknowingly, Wallace began to dream of breaking them. Wallace grew into manhood in this cauldron of injustice. He learned not only the lessons of the sword but the lessons of oppression. Each insult, each act of cruelty, carved itself into his memory. He may not yet have been the warrior we remember, but already the seeds of rebellion were planted. His education gave him words, his strength gave him courage, and the suffering of his people gave him purpose. He was a man destined to rise not because he sought power, but because power had crushed everything he loved. In these early years, Scotland seemed broken, bowed under English control. But history has a way of raising voices in the darkest hours. William Wallace would soon become that voice. The boy from Elderslie, taught in scripture and scarred by injustice, would grow to lead his people into a struggle that shook the very foundations of kings and empires. His story was only beginning, and though no one yet could see it, the birth of a legend had already taken place. The rising tension. By the mid-1290s, Scotland was no longer its own master. English sheriffs ruled its towns, English tax collectors drained its wealth, and English garrisons occupied its castles. To the people, the humiliation was unbearable. But to men like William Wallace, humiliation was fuel. Wallace was now a young man, tall, broad-shouldered, and already known for his fierce temper. He could not stand idle while his country bled under the heel of a foreign king. What began as small sparks of disobedience, harsh words with English guards, skirmishes in the countryside, soon began to grow into open fire. The first blow. Legend tells that Wallace's rebellion truly began with an act of violence, a killing born of insult. Some say it happened in Lanark in 1297, when an English officer struck him in a quarrel. Others whisper that it began when English soldiers harassed Wallace's family or mocked his people. Whatever the spark, Wallace's response was swift and final. He killed the officer, drawing blood not just for himself, but for Scotland. In that moment, Wallace transformed from a nameless young knight into an outlaw, and as symbol of defiance, the outlaw becomes a leader, now marked as a murderer and traitor by English law. Wallace had no choice but to flee into the forests and hills. Yet instead of cowering and hiding, he turned the wilderness into his fortress. Other men soon joined him, dispossessed farmers, hungry peasants, and even disillusioned knights who had grown weary of England's rule. Around campfires, they swore loyalty to him. He was no longer William Wallace, son of Malcolm of Elderslie. He was a captain of rebels, a man chosen not by crown or inheritance, but by the will of his people. Guerrilla warfare. Wallace's band struck fast and vanished faster. They ambushed English patrols on lonely roads, attacked garrisons in the dead of night, and liberated villages before the enemy knew what had happened. His knowledge of the land gave him an edge. He used forests, rivers, and hills as weapons. For the English, used to set-piece battles with knights in armor, this kind of warfare was maddening. They could never catch him. To the Scots, Wallace was becoming a legend whispered from glen to glen, the phantom knight who struck fear into England's soldiers. A reputation grows. With every raid, Wallace's reputation grew. In the halls of Edinburgh and Stirling, English lords spoke his name with contempt, yet with fear. Reports of his daring attacks reached King Edward himself, who dismissed Wallace at first as a nuisance. But to the people of Scotland, he was no nuisance, he was hope. Mothers told their children of the tall warrior with auburn hair who fought for freedom. Farmers prayed for his safety. Minstrels began to sing his name in secret taverns. Wallace was becoming more than a man. He was becoming a symbol. The turning point approaches. By 1297, Wallace's rebellion had grown too large to ignore. His forces were no longer a band of outlaws but a small army, striking not just at patrols but at castles and towns. More Scots began to rally under his banner, inspired by his defiance. The English now saw him as a genuine threat to their rule. And Wallace, once a hunted fugitive, was preparing to lead Scotland into open war. The spark had become a flame, one that would soon set the kingdom ablaze. Scotland's awakening after Stirling. The victory at Stirling Bridge had sent shockwaves across Scotland and England alike. For the first time in years, the Scottish people felt a breath of hope that they could rise above the iron fist of English domination. Villagers whispered Wallace's name in hushed reverence, hailing him as a liberator. Farmers abandoned their fields to join his ranks, craftsmen traded tools for spears, and young men looked to him as a figure larger than life. Yet Wallace was no king, no nobleman groomed for the throne, he was a knighted commoner, chosen not by bloodline, but by merit and unyielding courage. His leadership carried a raw honesty, a sense of purpose that Scotland had long been starved of. As his fame spread, so too did his responsibility. He was no longer merely fighting for vengeance or freedom, but for the soul of a nation. The English, however, now recognized the threat he posed. Wallace's rebellion was no longer a nuisance, it was a wildfire, and King Edward I would stop at nothing to extinguish it. Wallace's leadership tested. Though Stirling had been a triumph, the road ahead was fraught with peril. To hold Scotland, Wallace needed more than bold victories, he needed strategy, discipline, and unity. He began to organize his army, no longer just ragged bands of rebels, but a structured force. Villagers were drilled into formation, crude weapons were reshaped into pikes, and stolen English arms were distributed among his men. Wallace emphasized discipline, instilling in his followers the belief that even a common man could stand shoulder to shoulder with nobles if they fought with honor. Yet not all of Scotland's nobles welcomed him. Many lords resented Wallace's sudden rise, his popularity with the people, and his humble birth. They conspired in shadows, wary of his influence. Wallace, however, pressed forward. He did not crave crowns or castles, his loyalty was to freedom, not feudal politics. Still, the seeds of jealousy and division were sown, seeds that would later prove as dangerous as any English sword. Raids into England. In the months that followed, Wallace carried the war beyond Scotland's borders. With daring precision, he led raids into northern England, striking towns such as Northumberland and Cumberland. These raids were not acts of mindless plunder but deliberate moves to cripple Edward's supply lines and show the English that their king could not protect them. English villages burned, castles trembled, and panic spread among the borderlands. For the Scots, these raids were a taste of vengeance long denied. Wallace's men sang songs of freedom as they marched south, their morale soaring with each strike. Yet, these campaigns also painted Wallace as a brutal outlaw in English chronicles, a figure of terror to some, of heroism to others. King Edward, enraged by these incursions, began plotting his counterstroke. He would not underestimate the Scots again. Wallace, knighted and guardian of Scotland, Wallace's fame and success could no longer be ignored. In 1297, he was knighted, though historians debate by whom, and declared Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the absent King John Balliol. For a man of humble origins, this was an astonishing rise. Wallace now bore the weight of an entire nation's hopes. With Robert the Bruce still wavering between sides, and many nobles untrustworthy, Wallace's position was both exalted and perilous. He was no longer only a warrior but a statesman, responsible for diplomacy, governance, and the law. From his council chambers to the battlefield, Wallace embodied the struggle of a people clawing back their independence. To England, this was the height of defiance. To Scotland, it was the dawn of a new chapter, one written not by kings, but by the will of the people through their chosen guardian. King Edward, known as the Hammer of the Scots, was not a man to forgive rebellion. He assembled one of the largest armies ever seen, determined to crush Wallace's rising power. Thousands of English knights, archers, and infantry marched northward, their armor glinting like steel rivers under the sun. Wallace, aware of the storm approaching, rallied his men, urging them to hold firm. Yet deep down, he knew Scotland's fate rested on more than courage, it rested on unity. The fractures among the nobles, the envy and mistrust, all threatened to undo everything he had built. As Edward's forces advanced, the question was no longer whether Wallace could inspire men to fight, but whether Scotland itself could stand together long enough to survive. The Battle of Falkirk and betrayal. Edward's march north, the year was 1298, and Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, prepared his vengeance. Unlike Stirling, this was no rash campaign. Edward summoned his full might, a disciplined army of heavy cavalry, seasoned longbowmen, and mercenaries from across his domains. Chroniclers described the force as a moving city of war, wagons filled with supplies, engineers, priests, and banners stretching beyond the horizon. When Edward crossed the border, it was as though a tide of iron flowed into Scotland. Wallace, now Guardian of Scotland, knew the English host was vast. Perhaps too vast to face in open battle. Yet he also knew that retreat meant despair for the people who had entrusted him with their freedom. So he resolved to fight, and in the quiet of night, his council weighed the odds of defying the greatest king of Christendom. The cavalry's charge, with the Scots weakened, Edward unleashed his knights. Waves of armored cavalry thundered forward, lances lowered, banners streaming. The ground shook as if the earth itself groaned under the assault. When the knights slammed into the schiltrons, the first line of horses impaled themselves on the spears, but more pressed on. The sheer weight of steel and muscle shattered the circles, scattering men like driftwood before a raging tide. Wallace fought in the thick of it, cutting down foes with sweeping blows, his greatsword carving a path through chaos. Blood, mud, and screams mingled in the air as Scotland's line buckled. Some schiltrons held stubbornly, but others collapsed, torn apart by the relentless tide of cavalry. Falkirk became not a battle, but a slaughter, betrayal and retreat. As the slaughter unfolded, Wallace looked for aid from the Scottish nobles, many of whom commanded cavalry that could have countered Edward's knights. But their banners hung back, unmoving. Whether out of cowardice, envy, or treachery, they withheld their strength. Some whispered that they had always resented Wallace's rise, that they wished him broken so power might return to their noble houses. Whatever the truth, their absence doomed the day. Wallace's army, outflanked and overwhelmed, broke apart. Survivors fled into the woods, the moors, anywhere the English could not follow. Wallace himself escaped, his body battered but his spirit unbroken. Falkirk was a defeat, yet it was not the end. But betrayal cut deeper than any sword, and Wallace would carry that wound for the rest of his days. A fugitive in his own land. After Falkirk, William Wallace was no longer a commander of armies but a fugitive, hunted across the land he had fought to free. The fields of Scotland bore scars of fire and steel, villages left in ashes by English retribution, their people starving and broken. Yet in these shadows, Wallace moved like a ghost, appearing where least expected. With only a handful of loyal companions, he waged a campaign of guerrilla resistance, ambushing English patrols, cutting supply lines, and vanishing into forests and hills before retaliation could strike. The legend of Wallace grew darker now. To the English he was a lawless outlaw, but to the Scots he remained a beacon of defiance. Every appearance of his flame-haired figure in the mist gave the people hope that Scotland had not yet been conquered. Division among Scots. While Wallace fought from the shadows, Scotland's nobility played their own games. Some lords sought reconciliation with Edward, trading loyalty for land and titles. Others, like Robert the Bruce, hesitated, torn between ambition for the throne and loyalty to the cause of independence. To many nobles, Wallace was still an outsider, a man of common birth who had risen too high, too fast. His uncompromising stance against English rule clashed with their politics of compromise. In councils where decisions should have been made for Scotland's survival, jealousy and rivalry reigned. Wallace, disillusioned, withdrew from the councils, preferring the uncertainty of the wilderness to the poison of divided leadership. This rift weakened the cause, for while Wallace fought with fire, the nobility maneuvered in shadows, leaving Scotland without unity at its most desperate hour. The road to Europe. By 1299, Wallace understood that Scotland's survival required more than ambushes and fractured alliances. He looked beyond Scotland's borders, across the sea, to the courts of Europe. Traveling in secret, Wallace made his way to France, seeking support from King Philip IV. To the French, Edward of England was a rival, and Wallace hoped that Scotland's struggle might be a weapon in their broader conflict. Yet diplomacy was a battlefield of words and whispers, not steel and blood. Though he was received with honor, Wallace found promises scarce. He carried letters of safe conduct, spoke of Scotland's plight, and sought aid for his people. Some accounts even suggest he traveled to Rome, appealing to the Pope himself for recognition of Scotland's right to freedom. In these foreign halls, Wallace was no longer a commander of warriors but a lone envoy, carrying the burden of a broken nation on his shoulders. Returned to a changed Scotland. When Wallace returned to Scotland around 1303, the land he had fought for seemed unrecognizable. Many nobles had bent the knee to Edward, their castles flying English banners. The people, weary of war, longed for peace, even if it meant submission. Wallace, however, remained defiant. He resumed his resistance, gathering small bands of loyal fighters, striking where he could. Yet the tide had turned, England's grip was firmer than ever. And Wallace was increasingly isolated. To some, his stubbornness was heroic, to others, it was reckless, a refusal to accept the new reality. Still, his very existence as a free man was a thorn in Edward's side, and so long as Wallace lived, rebellion smoldered like embers waiting for flame. The capture and martyrdom of William Wallace. The betrayal in the shadows, the walls of loyalty, so carefully built during Wallace's rise, began to crumble under the weight of fear and greed. After years of resistance, Wallace became a hunted man, branded an outlaw not only by the English crown but also betrayed by some of his own countrymen who sought to save themselves from the wrath of King Edward. The English, desperate to crush the embers of rebellion, placed a bounty on his head, turning allies into spies. It was Sir John Menteith, once counted among Scotland's lords, who delivered the final betrayal. In 1305, lured into a false sense of safety, Wallace was ambushed near Glasgow. Shackled, bound in iron chains, and stripped of his freedom, the Lion of Scotland was finally dragged toward the jaws of his executioners. The betrayal was not just of a man, but of a nation's hope. Shackled and dragged south, once captured, Wallace was treated with no honor as a knight or warrior. Bound hand and foot, he was hauled through villages, displayed as a trophy for those loyal to Edward's reign. The journey from Scotland to London was designed to humiliate him, stripping away the last vestiges of dignity. People gathered to stare at the man who had defied a king, some jeering, others quietly weeping for the fate that awaited him. For days, the clatter of chains and the march of his captors echoed across the countryside. A grim procession announcing the downfall of Scotland's fiercest defender. But even in irons, Wallace's defiant gaze never wavered. He had become more than a man, he was the embodiment of rebellion itself, carried southward like a living warning. The trial of injustice. In August of 1305, Wallace was brought to London, paraded through the streets like a captured beast. Crowds pressed against the cobblestones to glimpse the man whom the English called traitor and murderer. His trial was nothing more than a formality, staged at Westminster Hall before an audience hungry for vengeance. No evidence was weighed, no arguments heard, Edward's judgment had already been cast. Wallace was accused of treason against a king he had never sworn allegiance to, and of countless murders in the wars of resistance. When asked for his defense, Wallace's reply thundered with truth: he could not betray Edward, for he had never been his subject. His words, though falling on deaf ears, ignited sparks of courage among those who still believed in Scotland's right to freedom. The sentence of death, the trial ended swiftly, as all had known it would. Wallace was condemned to die in the most brutal fashion possible, not merely to kill him but to destroy his image and terrify those who might follow him. He was sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, a punishment reserved for traitors. The cruelty of the sentence sent a ripple of fear through the court, yet Wallace remained unshaken. To his captors, his silence was unsettling, his calm acceptance more dangerous than open defiance. Even in chains, the man exuded a dignity that the scaffold could not erase. Scotland's lion would roar one last time, not in battle, but in sacrifice. The last march through London, on the 23rd of August, 1305, Wallace was dragged from the Tower of London through the crowded streets toward Smithfield. His journey was one of agony and humiliation, tied to a wooden hurdle and pulled by horses through mud and filth. The streets erupted with shouts, some mocking, others mourning in silence. Wallace's body, bruised and battered, bore the weight of chains, but his eyes burned with unbroken resolve. To the English, this was meant to be a spectacle of submission; to the Scots, it became a vision of martyrdom. As the crowd roared, Wallace became a living banner of resistance, every step etching his legacy deeper into the heart of his people. The torture and execution. At Smithfield, Wallace met his fate with a courage that stunned both enemies and sympathizers. Stripped and tied, he endured unspeakable tortures, hung until nearly dead, then cut down, mutilated, and disemboweled before the eyes of the crowd. His suffering was beyond measure, yet not a cry of surrender passed his lips. His final moments were not of despair, but of defiance, each breath a silent vow that Scotland's fight was not finished. When at last his body was quartered, his limbs sent to the corners of England and Scotland as a warning, his name instead spread like wildfire, whispered in secret as a rallying cry for freedom, the martyr's legacy. Though Wallace's body was broken, his spirit became eternal. His death did not extinguish the flame of rebellion, it fanned it. In the years that followed, Robert the Bruce and others would take up the cause, carrying Scotland closer to independence. Wallace's sacrifice transformed him from warrior to martyr, from outlaw to legend. Across the highlands and lowlands, his story was told in whispers, then in songs, until it thundered across centuries. To this day, William Wallace stands as the symbol of defiance against tyranny. A man who gave everything for freedom, and in death, inspired generations yet unborn. The enduring inspiration. Centuries rolled on, but the name Wallace never dimmed. In times of hardship, Scots invoked his courage, in times of rebellion, they drew strength from his defiance. Even beyond Scotland's borders, Wallace became a universal emblem of resistance. From oppressed peoples across Europe to freedom fighters in later ages, his story was echoed in their own struggles. His death, meant to silence him, had given him a louder voice, one that spoke across generations. He reminded the world that freedom was worth every sacrifice, even when the cost was everything. Stone and steel memorials. By the modern age, Wallace's legend was etched not only in song and story but also in stone. In 1869, the National Wallace Monument was raised near Stirling, a towering spire overlooking the very land where he once triumphed. Visitors from across the world came to climb its steps and look upon the landscapes he defended. Within its halls lay relics of the hero, a long sword said to have been his, preserved as a symbol of strength. Here, Wallace stood not just as Scotland's guardian, but as a figure of global inspiration. The monument, weathered by wind and rain, carried his legacy higher than any gallows ever could. Wallace in the modern imagination. In the modern world, Wallace's story continues to thrive, reimagined through books, plays, and films. The most famous of these, though romanticized, brought his name once again to the lips of millions worldwide. While some legends blur with fact, the essence remains, a man who stood against impossible odds, who refused to bow, who gave his life so others might one day live free. His tale is not bound by dates or accuracy, it is bound by the unshakable spirit of resistance that he represents. Wallace is as much myth as man, and in that duality lies his timeless power. The eternal flame of freedom. Though more than 7 centuries have passed since William Wallace drew his last breath, his legacy burns brighter than ever. He stands immortal, not because of victory or conquest, but because of sacrifice. His roar against tyranny echoes in every heart that refuses to kneel, in every soul that longs for liberty. Wallace is not just Scotland's hero, he is the world's. His story teaches that even in chains, the human spirit can be free, that even in death, one man can light a fire strong enough to outlast empires. His name will never fade, for freedom itself is his monument. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, kindly subscribe, like, share, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to know when we drop new videos. We'd also love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about William Wallace's incredible story? Drop your opinions in the comments section below. We'll be right there with you, because here at Echoes of War and Battles, History You Missed, we're not just unveiling history. We're a family who loves history. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.